Welcome to the Mom and Mind podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kat. On our episode today, I'm really excited and honored to welcome Dr. Dan Singley to the podcast. I interviewed him 7 years ago, almost to the day, actually. I looked through my records to see when exactly we chatted, and it was right around this time at the beginning of the Mom and Mind podcast. He graciously offered to come on then and talk about paternal and a father's mental health. And just talking to him now and how far things have come in paternal mental health, but also the work he's doing in the world is just really fantastic. And although there's so much more to do, some of the work that he's doing now, including the training on paternal mental health, are really groundbreaking and quite necessary for the advancement of the mental health of fathers and men. In our chat today, we touch on some of the prevalence and the presentation, meaning what it might look like for a dad or father to be dealing with a perinatal mental health condition. And furthermore, some of the things that really get in the way societally and culturally, and some of the ways that men and boys are socialized, and how that impacts their mental health and how they talk about their mental health. Furthermore, we discuss some of the awesome training that Danny has developed in paternal mental health that I'm really excited for everyone to hear more about. And hopefully, if you have some foundational training in perinatal mental health, taking this advanced training will really, really add to your understanding of fathers. What I love about this training, though, is that you don't have to be a therapist to take it. There is so much information that is useful to know, but also breaks down a lot of the stigma around fathers' mental health. So, a little bit about Danny. Dr. Singley is a San Diego based board certified psychologist and director of the Center for Men's Excellence. His research and practice focus on men's mental health with a particular emphasis on reproductive psychology and the transition to fatherhood. Dr. Singley Dr. Singley won the American Psychological Association's 2017 Practitioner of the Year Award from the Division of Men and Masculinities. He is the past president of the APA's section on positive psychology and is currently the president of the APA's Society for the Psychological Study of Men and Masculinities and the President's Advisory Council for Postpartum Support International. He conducts trainings and presentations around the country to assist individuals and organizations to enhance their level of father inclusiveness, and founded the grant-funded Basic Training for New Dads, Inc. nonprofit and Padre Cadre social networking application just for dads, in order to give fathers the tools they need to be highly engaged with their infants as well as their partners. So let's get into it and meet Dr. Dan Singley. Welcome, Danny. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me on again.
Yes, it's been 7 years. I have to check the date to see if it's exactly 7 years since we last I had you on the podcast, but it's been a minute. And the whole time, you've still been working day and night for dads and fathers and have been doing so many super cool things, including the paternal mental health training that we'll get to later. But I definitely want to talk about that because it's like, the first and best of its kind.
You mean the birth of the fatherhood training? Huh? See what I did there?
So clever. So clever.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, thanks for coming on. In the time since I guess you were last, I've seen you many, many times since you were on the podcast.
Yeah, I've been watching you do all kinds of stuff for parents as well, by the way.
We're just doing cool stuff. That's just it. But yeah, I mean, we've spent a lot of time through PSI working on board stuff together. But I just, for perspective for folks who are listening, I want to run through a couple of things. Where do you see the kind of state of fathers and paternal mental health now, as opposed to 7 years ago?
It's improving, but not fast enough. And I would say the same thing about perinatal health, mental health broadly, and certainly maternal mental health. It's just part of the difference that I see, and this may be getting a little bit like I don't know, sociological or maybe controversial in some ways, but part of the frame here is what I've seen happen is that I mean we're 50 years post Title IX, 50 plus years post Title IX at this point, and that legislation was designed to right some of the systematic wrongs that kept women and girls from being able to advance. And in that 50 year, I'm not painting a picture of a level playing field here, but there have certainly been advances in a way, sort of we as a society seeing being able to show respect for females moving into traditionally masculine spaces, Supreme Court, boardrooms, so forth. And I've seen a less of a movement to show respect for men and fathers moving into traditionally feminized spaces. And so that to me is one element that I see certainly needs some work, like with stay-at-home dads, or getting involved like in mental health and psychology. But there has been more on the news about, periodically you'll see something about a dad with postpartum depression, drawing more attention to that we as a country are terrible in terms of parental leave and the sort of some of the specific pressures the dads will experience that overlap with but aren't exactly the same as what people of other genders will experience when they work of paid work outside the home. Those are some examples, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I hear bits and pieces of what you're describing when I talk to my female new mom clients, who are, some of them are saying that their partners do have parental leave, and when mom goes back to work, dad's taking a month off, and that's super cool. And then there are still certainly people who whose partners cannot, the fathers can't take time off of work, and they might be home for a couple of days and then have to go back to work, or at least if they do have leave, feel like they have to go back to work. Ugh. So yeah, I can feel some of the shift that you're describing, but there's still so much to do. Yeah. What do you think about that? Just that idea of, or the reality of some dads not hmm, really, really feeling like they can take that time, or feeling like they have to stick to those sort of more traditional roles. What are those pressures about?
So, I mean, first, as you alluded to, the financial realities and pressures oftentimes are what govern the play here, right? If really any parent, but I'm focusing on the dads here, is working three jobs trying to make ends meet, then the prospect of taking a month off or even several days off when living paycheck to paycheck is very much the reality. I don't have an answer for that. That's a broader systemic conversation to have,
Yeah.
and one that I have quite often in terms of like, how do we navigate this and what would that look like? I also, here in our practice, so I'm here in Southern California and the Center for Men's Excellence, we specialize in psychology of men and masculinity. Mind you, we also see, clients of all genders, but our branding and our expertise does coalesce around male identified people. And so end up working with, my research is on fathers' involvement with infants. And so we also get a lot of fathers, and a, a lot, I'd say a good chunk of the patients that I see are in tech and work at, tech or biotech and have fairly, intense, high velocity jobs. And it varies a lot. It varies a lot from within a company, from functional unit to functional unit, between companies. I also have a lot of folks that are up in the Bay Area, like, the Googlers and the Metas and Uber and so forth. And a lot of it depends on the supervisor and the division. But the short version of what we'll see over and over again is, I mean, if you can take 6 weeks off and we keep things going, what do we need you for?
Ooh.
And it's kind of like dog years
Mm-hmm.
when you start looking at it that way. But of course, there is nuance there and sort of how we're gendered to think about this, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
most
yeah.
of us, when we think about perinatal mental health, really what term that gets used more is maternal
Mm-hmm.
mental health. And so for folks that do have a more traditional sense of gendered parenting, it's kind of an assumption around, well, yeah, the dad doesn't really need to be there. You know, for
Mm-hmm.
talking in sort of typical, cishet family constellations, like, I mean, and you'll see this actually, like sometimes it'll make the news when like an MLB pitcher
Mm-hmm.
doesn't go to a game.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'll see like the sports pundits, like, come out of the woodwork,
Yeah.
like shaming or saying like, this isn't your thing. And the last part of your question was like, where does that come from? It comes from socialization.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'll hear all the time. Like I'm actually about to teach our dad's class tomorrow, and so we'll get people from all different, different countries, different areas, and periodically I will hear folks say stuff like, you'll hear the guys say, "Well, I don't have the boobs, and like, she's the gatherer, and I'm the hunter,
Mm-hmm.
and I can, only do this and that stuff," and they want to come with these sort of like fairly bogus, like evolutionary, like behavioral genetic. Sure, there are some contributions from that zone,
Yeah, yeah.
but it doesn't add up to you can't change a diaper or do skin to skin
Mm-hmm.
or like that. And so
Mm-hmm.
largely, I think it has to do with how we're socialized to think about early parenthood and men and the role of fathers.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. I imagine it's going to take a long, long time for things to shift because it was more like the hunter gatherer analogy. It's been like that for a long, long, long time. Um, and it's I'm sure very different in different countries. There's all kinds of differences in societal expectations of men and boys that really get deeply, deeply rooted in. So, how do you, I guess for here, US here, um, what is paternal mental health? What is going on with dad's mental health in the reproductive period?
So broadly speaking, there are a series of somewhat predictable kind of milestones throughout, the perinatal conception to about a year or so postpartum. And no situation is the same, but to me, like the top level question is, was this a planned pregnancy or not?
Mm.
And if it was planned, if if it were, so again, Southern California, lots of family constellations,
Yeah.
family polycules, like that, but I'm sort of going with the traditional. You've got if one parent was leading the charge and the other one might have been holding back, versus they're both on the same page. This is the time. Let's do this.
Mm-hmm.
Is one very important top level consideration.
Yeah.
From there, there are plenty of cultural implications for how we understand pregnancy and experience it. If there are pregnant, complications during the pregnancy, if it becomes high risk and the birth itself. But if we're going to take all of these and say like, okay, let's say it follows kind of a typical course, um, father's doing the daddy nesting thing, certainly by the third trimester or so, like assuming that they engage in paid work, what are we going to do about money? Even if they're not, the
Mm-hmm.
fear about like, how am I going to do work? How am I going to do work life? Are our baby and partner going to be safe and happy and healthy and so forth? And then, sort of the birth itself and then how that plays out. And there, one pretty common shift that I've seen that even some of the more like well therapized or pretty like, progressive, like they're in it in the process, in the birthing process, is a real shift in their sense of identity about who I was before and who am I now. And
Mm-hmm.
some folks experience this more like the sort of, it's not a loss of independence, but it's important to recognize that experiencing a kind of grieving or loss in the wake of a birth
Mm-hmm.
seems a little counterintuitive, but that's not just about death.
Right.
right? That's like a sense of identity, like who was I before?
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes the change in my relationship with my partner, like I had him, her, or them all to myself.
Mm-hmm.
And now there's this whole shifting dynamic. And so there's room certainly for, adjustment, not room, you are adjusting.
Right.
There's room for stress and distress. And within that, the common prevalence, at least for maternal postpartum depression is 10%. So 1 in 10 dads will develop postpartum depression. It's typically not at that 1 month postpartum where we do the differential diagnosis between baby blues and MDD, peripartum onset for women. It usually tends to spike 3, 4, 5 months postpartum. And
Mm-hmm.
I could say more about that, but that reflects one of those sort of somewhat predictable milestones. Independent, oh, not independent, alongside the depression, anxiety and anxiety disorders. I don't just mean like I'm kind of stressed out. I mean PTSD, acute stress, generalized anxiety, OCD, and so forth. Those prevalence rates are almost 20%. Those vary from like 4 to 18% in the
Mm-hmm.
postpartum period, and
This
they're
research
oftentimes
is
not really on the
just
radar.
like just dads, people who identify as dads.
Yeah, just the
Mm-hmm.
dads.
Mm-hmm.
Just the dads. There's a solid meta-analysis, like a review that came up with. It was like between 2 and 16% develop an anxiety disorder during pregnancy, and like 4 to 18% in the postpartum period. Which from a public mental health perspective, that's a huge number.
It is
And
huge.
as we know, depression and anxiety tend to go together,
Yeah.
and it's not just depression and anxiety, right? Like in reproductive mental health, we don't really talk enough about like some of the developmental disorders, right? ADD, ADHD, autism spectrum, substance, sexual function and dysfunction. Like there's these kind of areas where we tend not to focus that much. Oftentimes because like developmental stuff doesn't start in the reproductive period. But I'm here to tell you, like dads that I will work with who have Asperger's and or ADD and have found really solid ways to be high functioning to cope with it. Well, the transition to parenthood brings with it relational, environmental, sensory changes, which really require thoughtful intervention that's tailored to the person. So these are some of the, I think, the really key elements to be looking out for, and certainly the relationship, right?
Yeah.
Like most of the research shows that it's the quality and the satisfaction in the parents' relationship that strongly impacts their individual mental health, and in a
Yeah.
sense serves as that crucible within which their baby's well-being grows.
So, as you're, I mean, this is all super duper important. And as you're talking, I'm also thinking about the people who are listening who maybe have what I will call like an older school mentality, or
Mm-hmm.
just haven't come up to speed, saying like, well, nothing really happens to the dad. It's all like it's the mom who's pregnant. Or it's the mom who gave birth, and it's the mom who's nursing, and dads don't get postpartum depression. I mean, you still see that kind of
Yeah,
thing,
I hear
right?
that certainly.
And it's not like one or two people. A lot of people are still holding on to that. But right, then the new paradigm, or the one that you and all of us are trying to shift into, is that actually it affects the the whole system, the family system, and dad or partner is a massive part of that. They have thoughts, they have feelings, all of that stuff, even if it's not being expressed outright. What about the specifically postpartum depression? Can you talk a little bit about um, what is seen in the research about hormones and what is actually shifting for the partner?
100%. Let me first make a general statement.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I focus on fatherhood and men's issues. I am no kind of a gender warrior. I'm not. I don't presume to be able to tell people what their families need to look like. And the
Right.
reality is there are all different kinds of families and all different backgrounds and all different contexts, and they make it work and they have their own struggles. So I'm not, I'm not here to make blanket statements about the way men need to parent or families need to operate, and for folks that do have a more traditional bent with respect to their gender roles, and it's working, cool.
Right.
And to the question though about the biological changes, this is something that a lot of people don't know. And you're right. Like I do a lot of training. I regularly get hands going up with people saying, "Look, can't you just let the moms have it? And this is their area and so forth." And respectfully, I'm like, no, because this is about parents.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about gender per se. This is about parents and the family system.
Mm-hmm.
And the research certainly supports the prevalence factors that I was just throwing out there, prevalence rates. And no, I personally, I'm not okay with leaving a whole segment of the parenting population out there to just hope for the best with their mental health. And
Right.
um, one of my colleagues, Darby Saxby, she's at USC, and another, I haven't actually met Ruth Feldman. She's in Israel. The two of them have really done pioneering work that looks at neurobiological and the neuroendocrine functioning of fathers in the early period. And they've done both sort of like, taking, hormonal samples, but also using fMRI to look at some of the neurobiological shifts that happen in fathers. And the short version of what they found is that this is a very important caveat. For fathers who are hands on during the pregnancy, during the birth, and then with the baby, these fathers experience the same hormonal shifts that mothers do, that gestational mothers do, and that gestational trans fathers do, right? It's just that in these fathers who are not gestational, the decrease in testosterone, the increase in estradiol, the increase in pair bonding, vasopressin, oxytocin, and increase in cortisol and so forth, like the directions are the same. It's the magnitude in the fathers that are less, and they are significantly different than those levels in the general community, in the general population. So, in that sense, you can absolutely say, and the same thing with like the neurobiological circuits that tend to light up around um, interpersonal, social, emotional functioning. They look very similar when they're highly involved with their babies. But that being said, I mean, as well as I do, even better, it's a mistake to boil the parenting experience and certainly perinatal mood and anxiety disorders down to just a biological phenomenon.
Right.
Biology and hormones absolutely contribute. I'm the last person that's going to agree with that. In fact, there's now solid research on fathers longitudinally following them that does typically they tend to look at testosterone in men that can show direct relationships in cortisol levels and dysregulation, and then the subsequent timing and development of postpartum depression. But for any parent, we shouldn't be saying it's only about the biology, it's only about hormones, because relationship factors, SES factors, race, ethnicity, family, they all of these dimensions come together for a unique constellation of strength and resiliencies, but also risk factors, and that includes dads.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I don't. It's really sad, I guess, frustrating that again, we're speaking of dads specifically here, that there's still so much that they have to work against. Like, let's say they're societally, right? Because they're quote unquote not supposed to have whatever feelings people think they're not supposed to have, or they don't even have feelings. Um, in
They
terms
have
of
them.
some
They just may need a men's therapist to help them find them.
yeah, that's the thing. I like absolutely people have feelings. Um, but if somebody, let's say there's a dad who's struggling, maybe suffering, um, it might be harder for him to say that he is struggling or suffering, or even say that he needs help or ask for help or even know that he can get help. So what do you I guess I'm trying to speak to and get your take on that silencing effect, how much that impacts them.
A lot. so
Obvious
so
question.
father, no, no, hey, I need softballs. Believe me, I'm 50. I don't think as well as that. Um, so generally speaking, I see the fatherhood identity as being predicated on the masculinity that one understands, that one enacts, and so that factors heavily. It's not the only factor, but factors heavily into how we show up as a father and what our sense of fathering is about. Generally speaking, when I ask folks, what does it mean to be a father? The trope is protect, provide, sacrifice. And the rubber meets the road here in terms of parent education or people that are doing ultrasound and the dad shows up, or just folks that are interfacing in educational or clinical service positions with these dads. And it is, I'm going to say, it does damage to these fathers to give them the message: your job is to be the rock and support your partner. That's what you got to do. And that gets even ramped up when that partner is experiencing a PMAD. Mm-hmm. It's not okay to end there. We have to train people to then continue that statement. And it should, to me, sound like, hey, Dad, it's important for you to take care of yourself, make sure that you can be there and be supportive of your partner. And you are going to need your own support. Mm-hmm. That is above and beyond what any one person can provide, including your partner, no matter how great they are. And fathers need to hear this. People need to hear this, because it's not in contradiction to, it supplements the protect, provide piece. Those are noble elements of parenting and of father: the protection, the provision, being selfless and sacrifice. I'm never going to say, let's get away from that. Mm-hmm. What I am going to say is, let's get away from a rigid, inflexible approach to fathering that says it's only about that. It's only about the resource provision. And frankly, what you asked about, what do I think has changed? One of the things that I think is that I see slowly changing. I see early fatherhood as the tip of the spear in terms of the reconstruction, the sort of ongoing evolution of masculinity. Hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is, these days, very rarely will you hear folks come out and say, like, it's not cool to be a caring dad. There are people that at the end of the day, like, nobody's like, yeah, be an absent dad, like, be a tyrant. Like, no, it's much more. And even for early fatherhood. And to me, we as a society beginning to show respect for and to reinforce and to normalize the caring aspects of masculinity, that it is cool to be a dad who can be tender and emotionally available to your partner and to your baby, even while being a hardcore litigator or a badass military officer, and having those spaces where the more sort of traditional aspects of masculinity are functional. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. Being able to then take that sense of, hey, actually caring in this context as a dad, in this context as a partner, is good and appropriate. In my heart of hearts, what I'm hoping for is that these fathers, as we move ahead as a cohort, start to be able to normalize and show that being caring and willing to accept influence, communicating assertively, taking care of ourselves, starts to get infused into other parts of their lives, so it gets normalized as part of being a man or a male identified person. That's what I hope for.
Right. Oh, I mean, right. And you're working really, really hard to get there. And I'm sure in some ways it feels like an uphill battle when there's a lot of these other societal things just like lobbying.
Such as advocacy, right?
That's right. So outside of, well, not just, but the importance for the dad, as we're talking about, to be able to recognize and honor his own mental health needs. What do you think, or can you speak to the impact of if dad is able to do that, get the help he needs, and so on, what's that impact on baby or kid and family system?
So, okay, so I'm going to be kind of a butthead and answer this question a little bit differently. The
Sure.
way that you ask that question is how, by the dad taking care of himself, does it impact the baby? And I'm not picking on you. Really, the first like 30 years of fatherhood and early fatherhood research asks exactly that question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how does, from a methodological perspective, the dads are an independent variable, and then baby and partner are the dependent variables. And so it was basically, what can dad do for them? And it's important, but like you said at the end there, it's a system.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that my research team has done is we've made the dad the dependent variable. And so we look at all these different, how does his relationship with his infant, his support from his partner, from family, his masculinity, depression, anxiety, and so forth. Like how does all that impact him and his psychosocial due to dad transition, but then also his involvement with his infant.
Yeah.
Right.
Great.
And interestingly, I think I think we're not really seeing any better messaging around fathers need to take care of themselves for the sake of themselves or really for their babies. And part of what I find is interesting is that even when these dads do get depressed, like the general assumption is they get depressed, they're going to be sort of vegetative and low energy and unmotivated, and then they're not involved with their babies. What our research team has found, actually, we don't the way that we look at father's involvement with infants is multidimensional, and so it breaks out play from the work to like a meta sort of monitoring the scheduling and the feeding and healthcare and direct care. Indirect care means I'm schlepping my kid around to, maybe I'm running errands or I'm taking them to doctor's appointments or whatever. What we've found, interestingly, is that depressed dads with depression, tend to be more highly involved in indirect care. And depression doesn't impact how much they engage in the work, right? Diapers, swaddling, soothing, putting down bottles and so forth, which it being independent, I find really interesting because it's sort of like, well, that's what I'm supposed to do anyway, which is very different than say 50 years ago. But your question was like, so what do we do with these guys when they struggle? Like, how do we even address that?
Yeah, I mean, when you were talking about it, you brought up another important question, or not question, but thing to address in my mind, which is the sort of presentation, what it looks like when a dad is dealing with depression or anxiety or whatever mental health changes he's experiencing, because it doesn't I think to what you were alluding to, it doesn't necessarily look like this withdrawn dad. What does it look like? What can it look like?
Quick Psych of Men crash course, and as it relates to this one, there's a very important term to be aware of: alexithymia. In the research literature, it's called normative male alexithymia, but people of all genders can experience it. A without, lexi words, thymia, feelings. And this gets at the sort of kind of stereotype of men don't talk about their feelings. And there's plenty to that because they learn around 5, 6, 7 years old that you're going to get shamed for that, and the gender policing begins, and they're less expressive. But a lot of men do adhere to an alexithymic presentation in which they may not simply even be aware of that affective internal experience, or they're aware of it, but they don't have the words for it. They don't know how to say helpless, hopeless, ashamed, worried, rejected, whatever it is. Or they do. They're in touch with it. They know what it's called, but they will never communicate. They won't say it. And so that just has a sort of it's not all men, and it's varying in different ways, but that's one really important psychological dynamic to be aware of. From there this is not in the DSM about depression. Although interestingly, the DSM-5 that just got revised did for the very first time include a caveat about gender and depression, saying that men are more likely to engage in externalizing and women are more likely to engage in internalizing manifestations of depression. which those of us that do this work, like we know because we see it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But it's cool to finally see that being included in the DSM. Um, there's what we call MDD, major depressive disorder, male type, or masked male depression. And this absolutely describes a common way that maternal postpartum depression will show up. And it's generally, as opposed to like I'm suicidal and weepy and I'm in the corner, or I won't get out of bed. Um, it generally tends to look like anger or just real extreme irritability. A tendency to do more drinking or drugs, or I mean, really kind of any dopaminergic behavior, video gaming, risky sex, jumping out of planes, gambling, shoplifting, whatever the thing is, like that an increase in that's that externalizing, problematic coping.
Like taking on new hobbies, even getting super into them, things that take them out, so to
Yeah,
speak. Mm-hmm.
which relates to third point, which is being more withdrawn.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that's interesting about the withdrawal of MDD male type is that you can be around people all the time. You can be at work around people. You can live in a multi-generational household. You're around people all the time. However, you're isolated because you're not engaging. And this can be a little confusing for folks like, well, he's just always kind of quiet. Okay, but let's get sensitized to that. And then the fourth common element of this male type depression is somaticizing, the tendency to, so like, I can't be depressed like I'm a man or whatever. However, I can have muscle tension or migraines or gastrointestinal distress or feel like there's a weight on me or something. And so when you kind of put all these together, okay, he's super irritable all the time. He's pretty withdrawn. He's playing video games all the time, and his guts hurt and he has headaches. Like he might just seem annoying or like a butthead, or is he self-centered or whatever the thing is, right? Even pretty seasoned clinicians who don't have a focus on men's issues or aren't sensitized to the perinatal nuances of mental health may not even connect it to the birth or the reproductive process, and that's that can be a real shame when that's the case. It's a very important part of the diagnostic and conceptualization.
Well, that brings me to your training, because I know I was in your training and it was fantastic, and even made me reflect a bit on my own father's experience as a father, as I was listening to you talk about father's experiences, and brought me to some new insight about my own dad.
That's cool. I
Yeah,
love
it was
that.
cool. It was cool. But what, to your point, like there are really great clinicians out there who don't have training or the training to be able to see and understand and get that nuance. So can you talk a little bit about what the training that you developed? I mean, there's so much in there, but just an overview of what it is and why it's so important.
Yeah. First, Kat, thanks for the kind words about the training. Like
It was so good, Danny.
that means a lot to me. I'm like, I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm super excited about it. So I worked on it for about a year and a half. It's a day-long training. It's offered. I'm one of PSI's trainers. And we did it for the first time here in San Diego in April, and then again at the annual conference. So as I say, it's a day-long training. That's part of the advanced psychotherapy track for PSI's perinatal mental health certification. And it I mean, it really is a labor of love for me because we get to drill into much more detail about um, background factors and the current state of the literature and trans dads and African American dads and adolescent dads, some of the special issues that come up around different sorts of fathers, and then we really drill into in the afternoon the clinical nuts and bolts, and we'll look at what are some ways to tweak. Like it's not for people that don't have any familiarity. It's an advanced training, and so we kind of assume that you're familiar with things like cognitive behavioral therapy, mindful, acceptance and commitment therapeutic, interpersonal psychotherapy, and we really get into like assessment, like what are some of the key assessments to use that have been validated on fathers and men, how to incorporate those into sort of more nuanced conceptualizations about fathers in place from an intersectional frame, them between their ears, in their family, in their neighborhood, in in the systems that draw to bear on them. And it is so fun to do. And it's really lovely to be able to have a space where folks clearly want to be able to turn around and take some of that to their own setting. So yeah, I have been thrilled to. We're actually doing it again. We're going to be doing it in Florida in October, and in an ongoing way. And I definitely encourage folks, if you're even kind of like, oh yeah, the dads, as you're listening to this podcast, and you're a clinician, or of also like you might be a lactation consultant. You might be, a doula or an administrator of some sort, and it would help you to just know some of the specifics about what these interventions and conceptualizations and assessments and programmatic approaches look like. Come check it out. It's called Foundations in Paternal Perinatal Mental Health, and you can go to postpartum.net and get information about it. You can request having it brought to your community if you feel like you got enough folks that would be interested.
Yeah, I mean, it's so important and so necessary, and there's nothing else like it, unfortunately. But also, I'm so grateful that you did do this and you put so much time and effort and energy into it. And I know some of the sort of behind the scenes work that you've done on this. It's just so incredibly impressive. And I was sitting in the back of the room, and so I could get kind of like a scope of other people who were in there and listening. I saw so many like heads shaking, hands going up, like grunts and sounds of just like acknowledging the truth of what you guys were training on, and that's part of the one of the reasons I wanted to have you on, because this is so important. It is so incredibly important. You're doing groundbreaking work, and I'm just so grateful.
Thanks. Yeah, I got to tell you, like, if we can just kind of like shut the doors and it's just you and I talking on your podcast here, I was intimidated. I'm like, oh man, this is the first time we're doing this at the conference. It's the big leagues. Kat's like an awesome therapist and the president of PSI. I was like, better watch it. So I'm like, okay, cool. I had a little bit of nerves on that front, but no, it sounds.
No,
I appreciate you being there and the grace and the kind words and that's a very big deal. It means a lot to me, and I'm hoping it just gets bigger and bigger, so more folks can take that knowledge and apply it in their own settings.
Cool. Thanks so much for coming on and sharing all this with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
I just loved this conversation with Danny, and I loved the training that he is doing through Postpartum Support International. I highly suggest it. Having sat through that training myself, I can tell you personally how valuable it is, and just how much you'll learn. Even if you have some fundamental knowledge of father's mental health, there's so much more information in this training. Connect with Dr. Singley at menexcel.com. And you can also find him on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at menexcel. And you can go to Postpartum Support International and look for the trainings that PSI offers. The Foundations in Paternal Mental Health is one of them. And as he said, if you're interested in having this training near you, you can inquire about that as well through PSI. Please do share this episode with anybody, any therapist, any person who comes into contact with any new father, because the information is important. I mean, as you heard in our conversation, it's not just about mental health, but it's about how society and culture impacts men and fathers and how that impacts mental health. So there's really good information in here for everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. Until next time.